Major Harper Taylor, a 40-year-old decorated officer in the United States Army, was finally enjoying a rare day off. With her military career spanning 2 decades, Taylor had led troops through some of the world's most dangerous zones, earning numerous accolades along the way. But today, she was simply a woman looking for a new pair of running shoes. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and sneakers, her short-cropped hair peppered with strands of silver, she blended effortlessly into the busy crowd at the Westfield Mall in Los Angeles. The sounds of chattering shoppers and distant music filled the air as she moved from one store to the next, her mission clear: find comfortable shoes and maybe grab a smoothie afterward. As she scanned the shelves, she noticed a few curious glances in her direction. It wasn't unusual. Her commanding presence often drew attention, especially in civilian settings. But she brushed off the stares, more focused on her task. Little did she know, Officer Jack Mitchell, a mid-level cop with a reputation for being quick to judge, had just walked into the mall. Clad in a plain white shirt and jeans, his badge and gun visible on his hip, Mitchell's eyes locked onto Taylor as she stood by the sneaker display. Something about her, perhaps her confident posture or the way she carried herself, made him suspicious. As he lingered near the entrance of the store, Taylor remained unaware, lost in her quest for the perfect pair of shoes. Officer Jack Mitchell had just stepped into the bustling Westfield Mall, his off-duty attire making him blend in with the crowd, though the badge on his belt and the gun holstered at his side told a different story. At 38, Mitchell had earned a reputation in his precinct for his quick judgments and even quicker reactions when things got tense. His actions had sparked complaints before, especially for racial profiling, but those complaints were often brushed under the rug by his department. Today, however, Mitchell was off duty, a rare opportunity to do something other than patrol the streets or deal with the endless paperwork that came with his job. But as he wandered past the high-end stores, his eyes landed on Major Harper Taylor, and something about her caught his attention. She wasn't like the usual shoppers he'd seen at the mall. Sure, she was dressed casually, in a black hoodie and sneakers, but her posture was different. She carried herself with an undeniable confidence, a certain air of authority. Taylor moved with purpose as she browsed through the sneaker display, her eyes scanning the shelves with military precision, as if she were planning a mission. Mitchell couldn't help but stare, his mind racing with assumptions. Who was she? Why did she seem so out of place? Was she one of those professional types who only wore high-end brands? Or was there something more to her? He stood just outside the store, pretending to check his phone, but all the while, his gaze was fixed on Taylor. He tried to rationalize his suspicion. After all, she didn't look like the typical mall-goer. Perhaps she was casing the store, maybe looking to steal something. The more he watched, the more a sense of unease settled in his gut. She was definitely acting strange, right? No one in this upscale mall ever shopped for sneakers without a particular reason, at least not people who looked like her. As Mitchell stood there, wrestling with his thoughts, Taylor casually picked out a pair of running shoes and made her way toward the counter. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet Mitchell felt a strange urge to follow her, to get closer. Something about her, the way she carried herself, just didn't sit right with him. He watched her interact with the cashier, a young, nervous-looking kid who rang up her shoes with a shaky hand. Taylor handed over her credit card and waited patiently as the transaction went through, but Mitchell remained on edge. His instincts screamed that there was something off. Was she involved in something shady? Did she have stolen credit cards? A fleeting moment of doubt passed through his mind, and in that moment, he made the decision to approach her. He stood up from his spot, tucking his phone into his pocket and walking toward the exit of the store. As Taylor exited, bag in hand, he stepped into her path. His cold voice broke through the noise of the busy mall as he said, "Excuse me, ma'am. I need to ask you a few questions." As Officer Jack Mitchell stepped into Taylor's path, he could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She paused for a brief moment, then raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor not giving away any sign of fear or confusion. Taylor had dealt with tense situations before, life-or-death decisions in foreign lands, difficult negotiations with hostile forces, but nothing in her 2 decades of service had prepared her for this. A simple trip to the mall, a day off to recharge, had turned into an unwanted confrontation. Mitchell's voice was firm as he blocked her way. "I need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone sharp and cold. his hand resting just above the grip of his gun. Taylor noticed it immediately. The slight shift in his stance told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about asking questions. It was about control, about asserting dominance. And in her experience, people like Mitchell didn't just ask questions, they made assumptions. Taylor, still holding the bag with her new shoes, didn't immediately respond. She observed the officer carefully, taking in the tense set of his jaw and the almost predatory gleam in his eyes. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice even, not laced with any emotion. It wasn't fear that ran through her veins. It was the kind of steady calm that came from years of training. She'd been in worse situations, faced greater threats, and walked away with more than just her life intact. But this felt different. She could sense it in the way Mitchell sized her up, like he was measuring her worth, his mind likely racing with assumptions about who she was and what she might be doing. Mitchell didn't answer directly. Instead, he glanced at her for a moment, then looked away, his eyes narrowing. "You look suspicious in there," he said, his voice flat. "Mind telling me what you were doing?" A flash of irritation crossed Taylor's face, but she kept her composure. The question felt absurd. She'd been shopping for a pair of sneakers, like any other person in the mall. But it wasn't just the question that irked her. It was the tone, the insinuation. "I was buying shoes," she said, holding up the shopping bag as if to offer proof of her innocent errand. "Is that a crime now?" Mitchell's eyes flickered briefly to the bag, but his focus quickly returned to her. His posture stiffened, and Taylor could feel the tension growing thicker between them. "Let me see your ID," he demanded, his hand now resting more firmly on the handle of his gun. Taylor's patience, honed over years of dealing with tense, often life-threatening situations, began to wear thin. She took a slow breath, her mind quickly processing what was happening. This wasn't about a pair of sneakers. This was about something far more insidious. She was being judged, not for her actions, but for who she was, for what she looked like. Her heart sank, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't about to give this officer the satisfaction of making her feel small. "Why?" she asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Have I done something wrong?" The hand on Mitchell's gun tightened, and Taylor's sharp eyes caught the flicker of unease that passed over his face. She could tell he wasn't used to being questioned, certainly not by someone like her. In a city where her uniform often commanded respect, it was strange to see the opposite happening in a place like this. But Mitchell didn't answer her question. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, a barely concealed threat hanging in the air between them. The moment his words hit her ears, Taylor knew. This wasn't about what she had or hadn't done. This was about him, his assumptions, and the prejudices that had been allowed to fester unchecked. He didn't know her, but he had already decided who she was based on her skin color and the way she carried herself. In that split second, she knew she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Not when she had faced down more dangerous adversaries than this officer could ever imagine. "Officer," she said, her voice dropping lower, more authoritative, "I'm going to ask you to step back. I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be treated like a criminal for shopping." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Mitchell stood still, his hand still on his weapon. His eyes narrowed further, and Taylor could see the frustration building in his features. But then, the tension in the air seemed to snap. Without warning, Mitchell's fingers twitched toward his gun. Taylor's mind raced, but she didn't panic. This was exactly what she had trained for. She wasn't about to let this man escalate the situation further. She knew exactly how to handle high-stakes situations, how to defuse tension before it turned deadly. But there was something different about this encounter. It wasn't just a fight for her safety. It was a fight for respect, for fairness. "Put the gun down, officer," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. She took a step back, her posture straight, but not a single muscle tensed. She was ready for whatever came next. But Mitchell wasn't listening. He was already moving, his fingers inching toward the weapon on his hip. The crowd around them seemed to hold their breath as the situation took a turn for the worse. The air in the mall seemed to freeze as Officer Mitchell's hand hovered dangerously close to the grip of his weapon. Taylor's heart raced, but her mind was a picture of clarity. She had seen similar situations before, but never quite like this. The feeling that washed over her wasn't fear, it was the weight of realization. This wasn't about a simple exchange of words, a casual encounter. It was about power, control, and the deep-seated biases that often went unnoticed in everyday life. Mitchell wasn't just questioning her actions. He was questioning her very right to exist in that space, her right to be there as she was. And in that moment, she knew exactly what she had to do. "Officer," Taylor said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm going to ask you to step back. I have done nothing wrong, and I won't be treated like a criminal for simply shopping." The words felt firm on her tongue, more authoritative than any order she had ever given. She wasn't just talking to a fellow soldier or a civilian. She was talking to the system itself. Every injustice that had been brushed aside, every moment when authority had overstepped its bounds. And now, it was happening to her. But Taylor wouldn't allow it. She had been in hostile zones, negotiating peace in the face of insurgents, and dealing with life-threatening situations that demanded quick thinking and calm execution. This was different, yes, but her training never faltered. Mitchell's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening as he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His hand, now almost on the holster, twitched with the unmistakable intent to escalate the situation. Taylor's eyes locked onto his, unflinching, unwavering. She wasn't about to move. She had learned long ago that the key to controlling any confrontation was to never give the other person the power to intimidate you. She had dealt with far worse threats than a man holding a gun. Whether on a battlefield or negotiating with hostile forces, Taylor knew how to assess a situation, how to stay composed when everything around her was chaos. But Mitchell wasn't a terrorist. He wasn't an insurgent. He was a man with a gun, afraid of losing control. And that was something she could deal with. "Officer," Taylor repeated, her voice lower now, tinged with the authority she had honed over decades of leadership. "I'm Major General Harper Taylor of the United States Army. I suggest you lower your weapon. This isn't going the way you think it is." There it was. The name. The rank. Taylor saw the slight hesitation in Mitchell's eyes as the words registered, but the man was too proud, too stubborn to back down. His lips curled into a sneer. "Yeah, right," he scoffed, dismissing her words as if they were meaningless. "Get on the ground." Now, Taylor felt the familiar stir of anger rise in her chest, but she suppressed it with practiced ease. She didn't move. She stood her ground. "For what?" she asked, her voice even, controlled, but cutting through the tension. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. People had begun to notice, the murmurs and whispers growing louder as the crowd gathered. Some parents pulled their children closer, trying to shield them from the confrontation. Others pulled out their phones, no doubt recording every moment. But Taylor couldn't afford to be distracted by them. Her focus remained solely on Mitchell, on the weapon still drawn in his hand. "Don't make me repeat myself," Mitchell snarled, his hand now fully gripping the gun. Taylor could see his fingers twitching, ready to pull the trigger if he felt threatened. But Taylor wasn't the one who was threatened here. Not anymore. "Officer Mitchell," Taylor said, her voice now laced with steel, "I'm going to ask you one last time. Put the gun down. I'm not the one you need to be afraid of." There was a long silence, broken only by the faint sound of Mitchell's uneven breathing. For the first time, he hesitated. The crowd, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, grew quieter. They weren't sure what would happen next, but they knew one thing. This wasn't an ordinary altercation. At that moment, the young man who had been recording everything stepped forward. His voice was shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She just said she's a general, man," he said, his phone raised high. "You're pointing a gun at a hero." Mitchell's face turned bright red, and he whipped around, his anger flaring. "Stay out of this," he barked at the young man. But the damage had already been done. The words echoed in the mall, and more phones came out of pockets, recording the scene. It was a critical turning point. The power balance had shifted. "Officer Mitchell," Taylor said again, this time with more conviction, "you're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." Her words hit the air like a challenge. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been wrongly accused, wrongly targeted because of their skin color, because of the assumptions people made. It was a turning point. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a statement. And then, the moment came. The tension in the mall reached a breaking point as the crowd continued to grow, their whispers growing louder with every passing second. It was clear that something was wrong. but no one dared to intervene until one brave voice spoke up. A young man, who had been quietly recording the entire confrontation on his phone, stepped forward. He held up his phone, ensuring that the recording was visible to everyone in the vicinity. "She just said she's a general, man," he called out, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You're pointing a gun at a hero." Mitchell's face turned a deep shade of red as he whipped around to face the young man, fury boiling beneath his skin. "Stay out of this," he barked, his voice trembling with frustration. But the damage was already done. The crowd's attention shifted, and a murmur of shock spread through the onlookers as they realized the gravity of the situation. More people began pulling out their phones, recording every word, every movement. The atmosphere shifted from one of passive bystanders to active witnesses. People had begun to take sides, and they weren't just passive observers anymore. For a moment, Mitchell seemed paralyzed, his gaze flickering between Taylor and the growing crowd. His grip on his gun tightened, as if he were considering whether to push forward with his threat. But Taylor didn't back down. She stood tall, unwavering, her eyes locked onto his, and her voice calm but resolute. "Officer Mitchell," she said again, her voice carrying through the now silent space. "You're about to make the biggest mistake of your career. Stand down." There was a moment of hesitation in Mitchell's eyes. It was slight, but Taylor saw it. The doubt, the uncertainty, flickered for just a second. The crowd's murmurs intensified, and she knew it was now or never. The weight of the situation pressed down on Mitchell. He could feel it. The entire mall was watching him, recording his every move, and deep down, he knew he was about to cross a line he couldn't come back from. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had stopped, all eyes on him. Just then, two security guards from the mall rushed toward the scene, their faces pale as they took in the situation. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, looked between Mitchell and Taylor, clearly unsure of what to do. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Mitchell didn't respond. Instead, he stood there, his hand still on his weapon, his eyes locked on Taylor as if she were the only thing that mattered in that moment. But it wasn't just Taylor anymore. The security guards could see the growing tension, the shifting of power. The moment they arrived, they realized something had gone terribly wrong. They weren't just dealing with a routine mall disturbance. They were witnessing an escalating conflict that could turn deadly if it wasn't diffused immediately. Without waiting for Mitchell to speak, Taylor took control of the situation. "This officer drew his weapon on me for no reason," she said, her voice steady and filled with authority. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." The mall manager was quickly summoned, and within minutes, Captain Denise Harper, a seasoned officer from the local precinct who had been shopping nearby, arrived at the scene. As soon as she saw Taylor, her eyes widened in recognition. "General Taylor?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise and respect. She rushed forward, her tone immediately shifting from uncertainty to urgency. "What's going on here?" Taylor gave a quick but composed explanation of the situation, recounting how Mitchell had drawn his weapon on her without cause. Captain Harper's face darkened as she listened. She turned sharply toward Mitchell, her expression thunderous. "Put your weapon away, Officer Mitchell," she commanded, her voice brokering no argument. Mitchell hesitated, the weight of the command hanging in the air, but after a tense moment, he slowly lowered his weapon. His eyes darted nervously between Taylor, the crowd, and Captain Harper, realizing he was no longer in control of the situation. Captain Harper, now fully aware of the severity of what had transpired, turned back to Taylor, her expression softening with a mixture of regret and respect. "I am so sorry, General," she said sincerely. "This is unacceptable." Taylor gave a single nod, her gaze steady. "It is unacceptable, and I expect it to be addressed," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. As the situation began to de-escalate, the crowd slowly began to disperse, though the buzz of conversation still hung in the air. People had witnessed something they couldn't ignore, a moment where one person stood up against the unfairness of authority and where justice, in its own way, had taken root. But the battle wasn't over yet. As the mall security and Captain Harper moved to address the fallout from the incident, Taylor's mind was already turning. The ramifications of what had just happened were far-reaching. It was about more than just one officer's mistake. It was about challenging the very system that allowed people like Officer Mitchell to hold power unchecked. The fallout from the incident at the mall was swift and undeniable. Within hours, video footage of Officer Mitchell pointing his weapon at Major General Harper Taylor had gone viral. News outlets across the country picked up the story, fueling outrage from every corner of the nation. Social media erupted, with hashtags calling for accountability and justice trending across multiple platforms. People were appalled by the officer's actions, but perhaps even more so by the realization that this was yet another example of how unchecked power and racial biases could manifest in everyday interactions. The situation, which had seemed to be an isolated confrontation, quickly became a symbol of a much larger issue, one that had been quietly festering for years. Taylor's face was all over the news. She had become an unexpected symbol of courage and strength in the face of systemic injustice. People were moved by her unwavering calm and dignity, by how she had stood her ground in the face of not just one officer, but an entire system that had attempted to undermine her authority. The nation took notice, and with that attention came an outpouring of support from the military, from the public, and from her fellow soldiers. Many expressed their admiration for how Taylor had handled the situation, especially considering the immense pressure she had been under. Meanwhile, the pressure on Officer Mitchell was mounting. His history of racial profiling and aggressive behavior had been quietly overlooked for years by his precinct, but now that history was coming under intense scrutiny, the public demanded answers. Was this the first time he had acted out of line? What other incidents had been swept under the rug? With each passing day, more and more of Mitchell's past began to surface, and the department had no choice but to act. Within a week of the incident, Mitchell was suspended without pay, pending an official investigation. For Taylor, the suspension of Officer Mitchell was only the beginning. She wasn't interested in personal vindication. What mattered to her was that this issue was addressed, not just for her, but for the countless others who didn't have the platform or the rank to speak out. She gave an interview to a major news network, where she shared her thoughts on what had happened. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about the countless other people who have been unfairly treated, who didn't have the chance to stand up for themselves the way I did. This has to stop." Her words resonated deeply with many people. For some, it was a wake-up call about the realities of living in a society where power and privilege often go unchecked. For others, it was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done to ensure that justice was truly served, regardless of who you were or where you came from. Taylor's statement became a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long, a call to action for everyone to examine their biases and demand accountability from those in positions of power. As the investigation into Mitchell continued, Taylor found herself at the center of a movement, one that went far beyond a simple altercation in a mall. This was about changing the system, about making sure that everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with respect and dignity. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a powerful beginning. As the investigation into Officer Mitchell's actions unfolded, Major General Harper Taylor continued to use her voice for the greater good. She had never sought fame or attention, but the outpouring of support from the public and the military made her realize the impact of her actions. It wasn't about her. It was about the countless others who had been subjected to unjust treatment, who had been unfairly targeted and discriminated against. She had been in some of the most dangerous and unpredictable environments in the world, but this incident had brought her face to face with something just as dangerous: the deep-rooted biases that often went unchecked in everyday society. For Taylor, the confrontation at the mall was a stark reminder of the disparities that existed in the world, especially when it came to how people were treated based on their race or background. But it was also a reminder of the power that one person could wield when they refused to be silenced. By standing firm, by not allowing herself to be intimidated, Taylor had sparked a conversation that was long overdue. Her story was not just about one officer's failure to do his job. It was about the failure of a system that allowed such behaviors to thrive unchecked. In her interviews, Taylor made it clear that this wasn't just about her personal experience. "This isn't just about me," she repeated, her voice steady and firm. "It's about all those who don't have the platform to speak up. It's about standing together and demanding accountability for actions that affect us all." Her words resonated across the country, inspiring people from all walks of life to stand up for what was right, to challenge authority when it was wrong, and to make sure that justice was not just a privilege for the few, but a right for everyone. The story didn't end with the suspension of Officer Mitchell. It became a symbol, a call to action for communities everywhere to hold those in power accountable. It showed the world that even in the face of adversity, courage and conviction could lead to change. For Taylor, the fight was far from over, but it was a fight she was more determined than ever to win, not just for herself, but for all those who still needed a voice.